evening, everybody. Welcome, welcome. It's going to be a great night. It's been a great day here, and we're so happy to see so many familiar faces here in the National World War II Museum for our series of lectures and special presentations here in the United States Freedom Pavilion, the Boeing Center. I think most of you know who I am, Nick Mueller. I'm President and CEO of this museum, and it's an honor to serve in that capacity. I keep thinking that I'm on my last hitch, and they keep asking me to re-up, and I'm still here. So, and you're still here, which is even better. We have a lot of regulars, of course. This lecture series has been growing regularly over the years. I know some of my colleagues in the history department at the University of New Orleans said, you're never going to get 50 people to come down to hear World War II history or on a regular basis, and now we have 300, 400, 500 people coming to these sessions, and so thank you for your support and for being with us. Also, we have a few of our trustees. I've seen Carol Suggs around here somewhere. Carol, where are you? Right here in front of me. And Sonia Perez, did she come? And another one here. And any other trustees that I've missed, raise your hand, say hi. Thank you very much. And but especially want to recognize our World War II veterans. It's a tradition here to always recognize those World War II veterans who are here with us. If you would raise your hand or stand and let us give you some applause and recognition for your service and sacrifice right here. Whoa. This is your museum, built in the honor of your service and sacrifice and what you did for your country almost 70 years ago, and it will be here for a long time telling all of your stories. Tonight's program is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be about those we lost in this terrible conflict. And perhaps it's worth mentioning that today is 9/11, Patriots' Day, and a day of remembrance also of those who were lost in that tragic moment that many people remember at the same thought and feelings and emotions with which those old enough remembered how America felt when attacked on Pearl Harbor. So I hope all of you have had a chance to reflect and think about those lives that were lost on 9/11, as well as tonight, where we think about those lives who were lost in World War II. But we also, as we have just done, recognize those who made it back, those who survived to tell their stories and to build America into the richest and freest country in the world. I'm very proud to have had a small part in preserving those stories and building the museum that is going to tell those stories into the future. So I should say, again, thank you to all of you. Now, by way of introduction, I should say that above you here are all these magnificent warbirds that we have collected, and many benefactors have helped to support and donate, and that's the way this museum has grown. People from across the country and here in New Orleans have continued to contribute to build out the dream that began with Stephen Ambrose now some 23 years ago. And this is a magnificent new addition to our campus, which is growing rapidly with the Campaigns of Courage Pavilion being nearly completed across the parade ground. But the exhibit's still got to be built there, so it's going to be another 15 to 18 months before we're going to be able to open that pavilion. But tonight's event allows us to call attention to a different part of America's arsenal of democracy. You see the warbirds, and you see the tanks and the trucks and the jeeps and so forth, but tonight we're going to talk about a different kind of story, primarily a Pacific war story about the submarine fleet in the Pacific, often referred to as those who served in the silent service. And it was one of the few very powerful weapons that the United States Navy still had at its disposal after Pearl Harbor, and allowed us to carry the war to the enemy. The submarine fleet was only about 2% of the United States Navy, and yet it had a tremendous impact and was responsible for about 90% of the Japanese tonnage that was sunk during the war. The submarines ran silent, and they ran deep, and they faced tremendous danger, and those who served on the submarines were a rare breed of sailors. It took a special courage and a special mettle to serve on those submarines. And tonight's story is of a submarine and her brave crew, who were among the first to take the fight to the enemy. It's a war story, and it's also a love story. But it's not the kind of love story that is between a hero and a heroine. But it's a love story of three sons for their father and their mission to find their father's final resting place. These brothers not only brought closure to themselves, but to the loved ones who survived, the other 59 crewmen on board the USS Grunion who perished. There's a book out there entitled Finding My Father's War. Well, tonight we are fortunate to have with us someone who actually followed this mantra. Together with his brothers, Bruce and Brad, John Abele made it his mission not only to find his father's war, but to find his father. The sons of Lieutenant Commander Mannert Jim Abele, the skipper of the USS Grunion, brought their father and his men home. Most of you know him as in the corporate world and the business world as the co-founder and Director Emeritus of Boston Scientific, a medical instrumentation company that is known throughout the world for its great success, and he himself is known for his magnificent leadership in the business world. And I'm not going to spoil his story by saying anything more about it, but join me in welcoming John Abele.
Okay. Well, this will be interesting. First of all, thank you for coming. This is a very personal story. Yeah. I'm going to take it off. I'm one of these. I'm a walker. Thank you. And this is a very personal story. There are a number of people with me here who are actually part of what we call the Grunion family. And if you'd mind standing up, Dick and Mary and Rich and Paul, I'd appreciate it. Dick and Mary Bentz, Richard Abele, and Paul Watson. And they have different roles to play, and that'll become apparent as I tell you the story. It started a long time ago, but what's really important to understand is that there are many themes to this story. Obviously, it's World War II history. There are 70 personal histories. The Grunion had a complement of 70 sailors on it. Geography, where it was lost and how we found it. Genealogy, tracking down relatives of the sailors who died, which was not a trivial task. A lot of technology, figuring out how to find it and being told literally by everybody, you don't have a chance. Well, I'm one of those guys, I like the underdog sort of thing, and that stimulates me even more. And there were forensic engineering involved, and forensic genealogy, if you will, to be able to find the things we did. There was amazing international collaboration. In particular, there were gentlemen from Japan who helped us and gave us critical information. But then there were people from all over the world, from Australia, Brazil, Israel, who were fascinated by the problem. And they helped us through the reasoning to figure out the missing points that occurred. I like to talk about it as what they call a flock of birds syndrome. When you see a flock of birds in the sky, it's amazing. They behave in a coordinated way, but there's no single leader. And that's what happened with us. A lot of people joined it and then just did what was necessary to solve the problem. Pretty amazing. And then perhaps the most interesting of all is the number of improbables. I just remember so many times saying, "You gotta be kidding." But that's the way a lot of things happen. Sometimes, yeah, perhaps, the more you practice, the better your luck gets. I'd like to think that was the case, but I'm not even sure if that's the case. It starts here. This is a picture of the Abele family. My dad, of course, with the shirt on. That was the sub before the Grunion. And this was in Tiverton, Rhode Island, which is a place that belonged to our uncle, and we used to spend some summers at. My brother Brad is in back. I'm on the chair. I'm the youngest of three boys, and my brother Bruce is on the far right. This is Dad. This is Jim Abele in his military picture. And I was rather astonished to find that there's a gentleman here tonight who knows him better than I did. When he died, I was 5 years old. John Burr here took a class from him when my dad taught naval science at Harvard. And it was an amazing class. One of his classmates went on to be governor of Massachusetts. But my dad was very good at selling submarines. He was a real believer in the submarine corps. In the submarine corps in World War II and even today, it's a special group. It's less hierarchical than the surface Navy, and they like to call themselves the brown shoe Navy, and they call their ships boats, not ships. They like to sort of, tease people. That's a picture of the submarine, and what's relevant here is knowing what submarines look like generally. This was what's called a Gato-class submarine. It was a new, dramatically revolutionary submarine for the time. It was launched in December 22nd, 1941, the first ship launched after Pearl Harbor. Had a crew of 70, carried 24 torpedoes, but the thing to remember is it's pretty narrow inside. I don't know if you've ever been to any of these submarines, gone to the Chicago Science Museum where they have the U-505. Anyway, if you get claustrophobic, I don't think you want to go into the submarine service. This is a picture of the crew of the Grunion and their wives. That was taken shortly after this submarine was launched. They're numbered because that was part of the process of identifying and finding relatives. And so here's the timeline. As I said, it was launched December 22nd, 1941. Launched doesn't mean it's ready to sail. Launched means it's ready to float. And then they have to equip it, and then it gets commissioned 3 or 4 months later, in this case, April 11th. Commissioning is the process whereby the shipyard, in this case in New London, Electric Boat Company, passes ownership over to the U.S. Navy. So then on, it's ready. It departed New London on May 24th. Now, it's interesting to think of this rather compressed timeline. It arrived in Pearl Harbor June 20th after rescuing some sailors from a ship that had sunk, but they went through the Panama Canal. It departed Pearl Harbor 10 days later and went via Midway, where it refueled, and then went on to the Aleutians. Why the Aleutians? Well, because the Japanese occupied territory of the United States. The last radio transmission was July 30th, 1942, and that was the last. We had had dinner with our dad the night he left. He didn't tell us that he was going. He just had dinner, and then we went home, and one of the crew, there's a great, communication channel between all the wives, and they said they had seen the submarine heading out, and so that was the last we saw of him. And then on September 30th, we got one of those famous telegrams. We regret to inform you. What's interesting is they say, don't tell anybody about it, because we don't want the Japanese to know, because they're going to claim it as a win and all that sort of stuff. So that was awkward. My mother went and, as a wife of the commander, wrote letters to the relative of everybody on the ship. Now, she had known a lot of them, and then others she had to sort of drag out of the Navy because they weren't super excited about that, but it worked, and she got letters back. In this case, it says, could you help us? Was he captured? Is he in prison? Did he go down with a ship? Please, in the name of God, where is our boy? Only 22 years. So there were tons of letters like that. I was, 5 and 6 years old. I didn't really appreciate that. And we boys, were boys, so we just went on with our lives. But Mother was very stoic and continued on her role as kind of mother to the spouses and the relatives. Anyway, there's tons of stories that come out of that. His, three-ring binders, absolutely full of them. Our dad was awarded the Navy Cross. When our mother got that, she immediately sent a note to all the relatives saying, obviously this was in everybody's name. It wasn't for a single one. And then nothing happened. We three boys grew up. My mother taught violin school, very resourceful type. We all had jobs from early ages, and we did just fine, thanks. And we, in essence, sort of forgot about it. I remember seeing not too long ago a society of children of MIAs. And when my middle brother saw that, he said, hey, what's an MIA? I mean, it didn't hit us right. And we were very proud of ourselves, and we didn't cry. We had that English thing, you don't cry over these things. That's the males don't do that. And but our mother did, obviously, but she held it back. And then, starting in 1994, my middle brother, who had been a Navy pilot, he was a jet pilot. He was the first person launched off a carrier on the A4D because our name was Abele, and the commander was in one catapult, and he was in the other, and they pulled the wrong catapult by mistake. I love those stories. Anyway, in this period, my brother Brad decided to do research and said, let's see what we can find out. A lot of the people who might have known are dying off, so we have to go do a research. And he did an extensive research where he talked with some of your classmates, John, and many others. He talked with Captain Beach, who was in a submarine and heard the last transmission from the USS Grunion. So he had a lot of good information, except it was totally incomplete. And as a result, all we knew was that he was lost. We didn't know why, but we understood that at least he was in the Aleutians. This is an example. This is a website from the Navy. Actually, this is an up-to-date website, except it's not up-to-date, because they quote, "The Grunion's fate remains a mystery." So, you know, I don't blame them. This happens in the fog of war. And there are a lot of other websites that have updated it very, very nicely. Thank you. But it gives you an idea of what we as children trying to do this research had. Where do you find information? We talked to all the people, and we didn't get any help. And then this gentleman, Colonel Richard M. Lane, who lived in Colorado, was a hobbyist about World War II memorabilia between Japan and the US. And he came in an antique shop and discovered a wiring diagram. And the wiring diagram belonged to the Kano Maru, the name of a Japanese ship. And he was curious, but he sort of put it away for a while. And then something else happened, and this is very interesting to think about from an historical perspective. The internet was getting better. The internet, by the way, is 7,000 days old. You know, it's about a little less than 20 years, sort of mid-90s. Now, it's not really the internet, it's the World Wide Web that I'm referring to, the thing that allows us to do the amazing things that we do. Well, that was what enabled us to find out what we found out. And he finally got a message from a gentleman in Japan who said, I know about the Kano Maru. And he sent him some information, and he said, oh, and by the way, the Kano Maru sank a submarine. This is the gentleman. His name is Yutaka Iwasaki, and he actually worked for the Defense Department in Japan as a translator, among other things. He was a naval architect by training, and he was a fascinating World War II buff. And by that time, early 2000, there were a lot of websites on World War II history. And we discovered that Yutaka had written a note, but it didn't have his return address on it. And I was exploring the internet on these websites, and I think I came down to something, it was in the 70s, number 70, a post from Yutaka Iwasaki with an email address. And so I sent him a note. And I said, I'm a son of Commander Jim Abele and all of this thing. The submarine was sunk, and are you the Yutaka Iwasaki who translated this story? And the response was, it's me. Sincerely, I pray for the repose of your father's soul. Whoops. He then sent along some additional material. This is a story from an obscure Japanese maritime journal. Not a military journal, a maritime journal. And like everywhere else in the world, the Japanese Navy is up here, and the Merchant Marine are down here. True anywhere in the world. And as a result, the Navy never knew about this article. And although they had been informed, but they didn't believe it because the idea that a cargo ship could sink a submarine is just patently ridiculous. But anyway, up top there, it actually says, we sunk U.S. submarine. That's not exactly what happened, but this is the Kano Maru in Kiska, where it had been beached. So here's what happened. The Grunion was guarding the approaches to Kiska. And to give you an idea of where Kiska is, here's the North Pacific Ocean, and right in sort of the center there, whoops, I went too far, not far enough, there we go. This is the northern part of the North Pacific. with the Bering Sea above the Aleutian Islands and the Pacific below. And that red line in the lower left-hand corner describes the area that the Japanese attacked and occupied. And of course, when the Navy saw this, they assumed that this was the way in which they were going to come into the U.S. Even more important, this is a closer picture of where the confrontation took place. In the map to the left, Kiska Island is on the left. There's a volcano. All the Aleutian Islands are volcanoes. That's the Pacific Rim of Fire. And those volcanoes periodically are active. In the case of Kiska, it spouted once in 1992, and there are earthquakes all the time. While we were there for a period of about 10 days, there were about 30 earthquakes. Now, it turns out we had a volcanologist on the trip who's a friend, and he was from Woods Hole, and this guy just knows this stuff, and of course, he brings it up on his phone, and what an incredible world we live in. In the meantime, the Japanese went on and bombed Dutch Harbor, and Dutch Harbor is about 1,000 miles to the east. Now you're getting really close to the Alaska mainland, and they did a lot of damage, blew up fuel tanks and planes and so forth. But they didn't really follow it up very much. But they occupied the islands of Kiska and Attu at the end of the Aleutian Islands, closer to the Soviet Union at the time than they are to the United States. It's 1,600 miles from Anchorage to Kiska. So it's not next door. And these islands are rather interesting. You don't have trees on these islands. It's sort of like Lord of the Rings. They're fascinating. They're beautiful, but they're all shrouded in fog and mist. And when you drew duty there, it was kind of a short straw. And if you were in a surface ship, particularly a destroyer, you better have good balance and not be a seasick person, because you're going to be by the time you get through. So the what happened, I'll get into a little bit more as we get into the detail here. We had all this information from Utaka, and we were delighted that we finally knew what happened, sort of. A ship had been sunk, we think. We didn't know. We have a detailed log of the captain of the ship, who tells us that in the morning of July 30th, they looked out the cabin there and saw 2 torpedo trails coming at them. The first torpedo missed. The second torpedo hit the stern and exploded, took out the engine, took out the radio room, took out the stern gun. This was an armed freighter, fore and aft. And then it had tons of machine guns, which are useless against submarines as well. They circled around and got into position again, fired 3 more torpedoes. One went low. The other 2 were absolutely direct hits, but they bounced off. And not only did they bounce off, they floated, and the Japanese picked them up and later on examined how they were built. One of the problems in shooting torpedoes at the enemy is, in the early part of the war anyway, they were steam-powered. They left a trail of bubbles saying, "I am here, shoot me." And so if it bounces off, you're not likely to be very pleased. So that was the start of the story, and the submarine turned around again, looked like it was starting to surface. And they were firing at it with their bow gun. The submarine was sort of trying to get behind the ship, at least that's what it looked like, so that they couldn't fire at it without taking off the superstructure of the Kano Maru. And the 84th shell hit the washing wave. Then there was a noise, a dull thud. They couldn't see anything because the submarine was below water at that point, and a geyser or a bubble of dark brown fluid came up. They heard a dull thud, and that was the end of that story. The next day, there was a big oil slick in the water. So clearly something happened. The question is, what happened, and how far apart were those events? Well, we can't tell from what we have. That's the missing information. But that would have been very, very powerful. So in 2005, I met Bob Ballard. He talked at a meeting he was the entertainment one evening for a medical meeting. I go to lots of those things, and gave a really great story of the Titanic thing. And as I listened to him talk, I said, you know, I wonder if we might do this, because the way he described it didn't look that hard. and so I went and I talked to him again, and I told him what we knew, because at that point I did know approximately where this thing took place and the depth and so forth. But it was, when I say approximately, it was probably 20 square miles, maybe 50 square miles, something like that. So it's not a tiny area, but still reasonable. And he later agreed to come up to actually visit Boston Scientific and talk to myself and brothers, and gave us a lot of tips on how to do it. But he couldn't do it himself because he was working on another project in the Black Sea. And so my brothers and I got together and said, you know what? I think we can do this. And we went through a lot of strange connections and found a gentleman with a crab boat, a boat that looks very similar. I don't know if you've seen this television call. Thank you. Thanks for reminding me. It's very, very important to do that. Thank you, Mother. And The Dangerous Catch is a movie, if you will, about catching fish in the stormy North Pacific or the Bering Sea. And that turns out to be a lot what it was like. But this gentleman was very experienced, had been doing it for a long time. His crew was his family and some others, a young boy and a young girl in their teens, as well as he and his wife. But they were an amazing team and very, very skilled, and certainly impressed us. And then we hired a sonar team, and this was, again, based on Ballard's advice. He said two things. Number one, don't try to do it all in one trip. You're going to do a lot of analysis of the information you get on that first trip. Secondly, he said, how they found the Titanic, he said, follow the debris trail. Go sideways to the current, because remember the Titanic sunk in 2 miles of water. And so as it sunk, the debris that came off drifted downstream and left a little trail of corn, so to speak, the Hansel and Gretel trail, right to the target. And we followed that. And so we set off in 2006. We went in August because that's the calmest time of the year. And the Aquila, that's it right there, had been modified in order to pull a sonar sled, or towfish, they sometimes call it. And it's side-scan sonar. That's what it looks like, almost like a big motorcycle. There were two, one on the crane there, and there's one in the left. One is very low frequency that sees a long distance but very poor resolution. The other one is much higher frequency, and we used them both. But they would drag off the back a little bit like this. So a line comes down from the ship in the upper left and connects to a very heavy weight, 2,000-pound weight. And that's called a descender. It holds the line straight. And then there's a flexible tether that goes from the descender out to the towfish. The theory is that if the surface is wavy, then it'll be insulated and it won't bounce up and down because it's on that soft tether behind the weight. So it's pretty tricky when you're dragging this over the side of a volcano, because that's where we were looking. You don't want to drag it into the ground because it's a very expensive piece of equipment and you might not bring it back up. This is the sonar shack, which was really a freight container with the Williamson crew. They were our sonar operators looking at tons of graphs, the feedback from those devices. And this is the team that worked that. My three brothers on the far right, and the captain, daughter, and wife are on the far left. And they were just, a crew you could die for because they were just so smart and so insightful. Everybody was really proud of them. This was the first indication we might have found something. Now, I don't know about you, but that kind of looks like a cigarette smudge on a piece of paper. But the head of the team said, I think it could be some. In fact, a lot of them argued over it. But what makes it interesting is it's unique. It's not surrounded by a lot of other targets. Now, remember I said there are a lot of improbables on this? Already you've heard a number of them. How did we find Utaka? Come on. And who had this incredible information? And how do we get the crab boat guy who is absolutely amazing? Just go down the list. We were, frankly, amateurs is an understatement. But we're also reasonably logical. And we had some very, very good people on board. And that's the first indication that we had something. So we took another pass. And on the lower right, you see something that looks a little bit better. That might be something. And then the third pass is this. Now that kind of looks like a ship. It actually looks like a surface ship. We talked a lot with John Alden. John Alden is sort of the world expert on submarine wrecks, a long-term naval officer, and he was just fabulous. He'd written books on this and so forth, and that was very, very helpful to us. Now, the fact that it looks squiggly in the back there, that's not a picture of the target. That's the fact that we had to lift the sonar up and down as we went over these hills on the mountain that we were going sideways on. We didn't go up and down. We always went sideways to try to find a constant depth. And you couldn't go in every direction, otherwise the towfish would crash. Anyway, that looked pretty good, except for the fact that the mast or whatever it is way too far forward. It's not long enough, but it is about the right diameter. And that's a shadow you see on the left, and that can distort things. And so we did a next step, and the next step was to do a compiling of all the pictures we had taken over many days, and this is many miles. And on the top portion, I've circled the thing which we've called the Grunion, and now this was just the target. And then there is, believe it or not, a debris trail. And more than that, and you can barely see it here, I pointed out with my laser pointer, but it doesn't work on this screen, the fact that there's kind of a trail here. And on the lower left, it looks like there's a huge dent in the ground or whatever it is. Now, that takes a lot of creative interpretation. But we were encouraged, particularly that we may have had a slide trail, because that could really be helpful in finding it. Now, another sort of improbable is that there were 4 U.S. submarines of the 52 lost in World War II that were found in 2006. So that was sort of amazing to us. We talked with all of them, of course, so we knew the story. And so we were helping each other in the process. And then in 2007, the next, I'm sorry? Oh, okay, is that better? Okay, apologies, thank you. We went back again in 2007, this time with an ROV, a remotely operated vehicle that had video on it. And this is the crew. Richard Abele is there in the center. The man in the upper right-hand corner, not the far upper right, but second to upper right, is Donovan Webster from the National Geographic. Now, that was kind of interesting because the National Geographic got very interested and sent him on it, but Woods Hole had told them that the likelihood of our finding anything was less than 0. And the night before we left, they said, we're backing out. We're not going to do it. Well, as it turns out, Donovan is not only a National Geographic explorer, he's a very sharp guy. He had to back up. Reader's Digest. Reader's Digest said, absolutely, let's do it. And you know, we found it shortly after that, and we got another message from Reader's Digest, from National Geographic saying, wow, did we mess up. And that was kind of great. This is a picture from Kiska, up on a hill, actually just below a Shinto shrine that was still there. And the dock that was built in World War II, and that's the Aquila, to give you a sense of size, off to the right. That's a picture slightly to the left of the one I just showed you of Kiska in 1938. There was actually a small settlement there, mostly a weather station, but a few other folks were living there. But as you wander around Kiska, it looks like it hasn't changed much since World War II. There were mini subs. In fact, there was a picture in 1943, just after the U.S. had occupied it, of where those mini subs were. And there was all sorts of aircraft guns still just lying there rusting. You don't get a lot of people going to Kiska. It's not on a route to any place, really. So we had that plus. At one point, you can't see it, but the second to far right dial is showing wind speed. And the wind speed right there is 60 knots. That's 70 miles an hour. And it got up to 75 knots, almost 90 miles an hour while we were there. That's when we stayed in the harbor. One is not going to drop a $1 million piece of ROV over the side in that kind of weather. That's a picture of the front of the ROV. Pretty good sized thing. There are 3 cameras. It's got some very, very powerful lights. And in the lower left is a manipulator arm. And there's a picture of the backside of the same ROV. You can see in that backside there are 4 propellers that guide it up, down, and sideways. And the winch is on the lower right, that big circular spool. And on the left, there's a pulley, and that pulley swings out over the water with the wire from the winch going over to a descender type device, which is on the lower left, and then a long tether that attaches to the ROV. But in this case, you're not towing it around, it drives itself around. And so there's the process of launching it over the side. And what's amazing in this picture is the water. This is another improbable. It's calm. And I remember saying this. We went out, we did it, and then we went all night because we know we weren't going to get this. So we started, about 9 o'clock and went until 5 the next morning. It doesn't make any difference to us down there. It's always dark. This is the control shack where the ROV is controlled. The driver of the ROV is on the left. And he's got a little joystick sort of thing that he controls those propellers with. Now, if you've ever been to an amusement park and tried the claw that picks up the bear and gotten really mad because the darn claw never goes in the direction you want it, that's the way driving this thing felt like. It just was very counterintuitive. Fortunately, we had just a phenomenal driver who was able to guide that thing around with great skill. And in fact, at one point, after we did find it, we wrapped the tether around the superstructure of the submarine, and I thought that was the end. But he carefully just drove in reverse and undid it. Just an amazing job. This is going to take a little bit of help here. Come on. There we go. This is a picture, now a video, as we're following the slide path, which we had found just a moment before, and we're saying, you know, this is like rivers always run down, well, slide paths always run down. And you see a lot of krill in the water. Some days it was there, sometimes it wasn't. And out of the mist comes this shape. You see a little line going down there. That's actually a laser that's used to measure distance and depth. And depth. And what we're looking at is the stern of something with some growth on it. Some of it was really, really beautiful. The colors pretty much disappear at a distance. Now, on the right is the manipulator arm that also has a video camera on it, so we could stick it down into the cavities that we saw. And now you're seeing the outline of the stern of the submarine. The bottom is where the rudder is, and there are funny protrusions on the top. Those are called propeller guards. And one of the reasons we knew it was the Grunion is they were all removed in September 1942. And now you see the dive planes on the bottom there in the full down position, and that's a forensic clue as to what happened. And right in front of those dive planes is a propeller. Now look at that picture, and look at this picture. That's the submarine being built in 1941. See the propeller guards? It matches it item for item. This is a cross-section of a submarine, and understand it's a long tube. It's over the length of a football field, 312 feet. And although the outside is almost 30 feet in diameter, the inside is only about 16. It's double hull, and that's where the fuel is. Now, you think about 70 people in a tube 16 feet wide that's 300 feet long. And it could get a bit smelly, and you know, the air isn't very good and so forth. So that was life on a submarine. Above it is an outline of the wreck as we saw it. And this is very interesting. We took 3 hours of video at high definition, 60 frames a second, and then reassemble it. Unfortunately, with the water down there being very black and kind of foggy, we could only see about 30 feet ahead of us. So how do you see the whole thing? Well, you have an artist who happens to be another collaborator who is amazing, and he drew what it looked like. It was split open, almost as if somebody had taken a can opener to it. This is the result of an implosion. If the submarine goes below its crush depth, which in this case at that time period was about 600 feet, then it would just pop like a Coke can. And the good thing about that is death would have been absolutely instantaneous. This is another picture with a little bit more detail and names. And this is one of the pictures we took that was striking because it's an open hatch. You could not open a hatch if you're underwater. The water pressure is too great. However, think about it. What happens when you implode is everything goes in towards the center with enormous force and speed. And that compresses both the air and the water, because there was water in the submarine as well. And that just popped open the hatch. And it would have taken, there would have been about 10,000 PSI on it. So it obviously the pressure was greater than that to pop the hatch. This is another clue. In the top of that ring, that's the hatch again, but a close-up of it, there's a little dog leg that comes out. And if you look at it, it's broken off. So that means it was snapped by a sudden impact. This is a picture of the stern dive plane in the propeller that's sort of buried in the sand. And think about this. That submarine had been laying there for 65 years, and there had been all sorts of earthquakes, including the one in Alaska, which was a Richter scale 9, and lots of earthquakes, and in addition to that, the volcano had erupted. And so we weren't sure whether it might have been buried, but there it was, sitting out. Oops. Some parts of the submarine were almost pristine. I don't know what that metal is, but it looked like it could be a part, you could use on a new thing. And then we sent videos of this very extensive documentation around to a number of these experts who knew World War II submarines, and they explained to us what they were seeing. In addition, we came across the USS Cod, which is a sister ship of the Gato class of the USS Grunion, and that is a museum near Cleveland, right on the shore there. And therefore, we were able to go in and compare different aspects side by side. And there are more of the descriptions of that same hatch, more detail. This is the attack process that I described earlier. The Kano is in black, Kano Maru is in black, and it was hit at point number 2, and those are the times that were documented by the captain of the Kano Maru, but it kept on coasting. It lost its engine, but obviously it had about 15 knots of speed at the point and was continuing coast with a slight drift to the right, to the starboard. And G stands for the Grunion, with the first 2 torpedoes going there, and then it circled behind and fired again 3 torpedoes, which the stern one went behind it, and the other 2 were direct hits and should have exploded, but didn't. And this relates to a classic problem that's been well described, is that the torpedoes didn't always detonate, and they also ran low. So the smart submarine commanders, against all rules, tested some of the torpedoes themselves. They were in short supply, and confirmed that, and they had a network among themselves, and so they simply changed the depth, and thank you. So that's kind of a collection of improbables, and it's still going on. We're learning more and more. But now there are even more improbables. And Mary Bentz, who is here tonight, is one of the famous sub-ladies. These are 3 ladies who are actually relatives of crew members who have never met, but who are all very good at genealogy. And they took on the challenge of finding relatives for every single sailor on that ship. This was a story from USA Today, in which the project was successful. We didn't have pictures of everybody, but we had relatives of everybody, and we had a story of every single person on the ship. In fact, there's going to be a book, I'll show you a cover of it coming out later, that details those amazing stories. These were people that came from all over the country. This really was a people's war. Here's an example. This is Milliner Weaver Thomas. He was exec on the Grunion, and that's in the center there growing up, and that's the marriage picture. Vicky, the middle the far right sub lady there, found Peter Stevens, who was the son, but the mother remarried, so there was a name change. So found wife's second marriage in Pennsylvania marriage records, discovered new last name was now Stevens, that's good. Found she was listed in Social Security death index in Florida, no obit in a newspaper, so looked in probate records and found information about her that way. Probate records listed two sons, one was Peter K. Stevens. Then wrote to every Peter Stevens in Florida and Pennsylvania. Our Peter Stevens had an unlisted phone number, but public records said he lived in Allentown, wrote to every Stevens in Allentown. Letter that finally reached the correct Stevens went to his daughter's house, and she passed it on to her dad. And Peter Stevens showed up at a memorial service that we held later on. This one is even more extraordinary, and I'm not going to go into detail on it because you don't have time. But Jack Pancoast got married in the Philippines to Julia, over in the right, and they had a child, but after Jack had left to join the Grunion. So Jack Pancoast on the Grunion never saw his son. Julia came back to the United States with son, and you can see the picture there. And Jack Jr., that son, now actually has another son, which we call Last Jack. And the tracing of him is too complicated. And if you catch Mary afterwards, she will fill you in those details. But it's an example of the incredible persistence and the incredible power that you can do with these techniques. This one, Samuel Reed Dighton, was actually engaged to Henry Wallace's daughter. Henry Wallace, in case you don't know, was vice president at that point. And he was the love of her life. And later on, the daughter, correct me if I'm right, Mary, discovered a box of letters that had been written back and forth, you know, that are classic love letters, and again, sort of brings tears to your eyes. Stephen Surferchek was a cook. Carolyn, the wife, is there twice, as a young woman in the center, and as an older lady on the far right, and she came to the service as well. And that's the picture of her family. They came to the memorial, which was a wonderful bringing together event. There was a lot of publicity about this, and I know I was a bit sensitive about it because a lot of people would say, you know, why are you after all this publicity? There's a reason for this. Every time an article was published, thank you, Dick, every time an article was published, it stimulated new contacts with us. We kept growing the network. That's how you grow the network. You keep communicating. And so there were a lot, as I said, of articles on it. And finally, there's been a book written on it. It took a while, and it's over in the shop there. And I'm here to sign it, not as the author, but as kind of the subject, if you will. And there's another book that we wrote that's really a photo supplement that's got some amazing pictures in it, a lot of which I've showed here, but it goes way, way beyond that. And then there's a third one that's coming, that's not here yet, that the Mary and Dick are writing, again, about the detailed story of these sailors. That was an amazing period of time, and this was a huge impact for their families. In 2008, we had a memorial on the USS Cod. The Grunion's number was 216. This number is 224. They're both of the Gato class. And we actually had an admiral come and officially say that we had found the Grunion, and that's now in the records. And by the way, that was about as difficult as finding the submarine, but those of you in the military know that. And but it was a wonderful event, getting to meet these people. Submarine people are family, and it's a special bond. It was sort of less hierarchical than the surface Navy, and it was obviously a very high-risk task. That's an example of the room as you go towards the bow of the USS Cod with 4 of their 6 torpedo tubes forward. And Utaka actually visited us at that event by Skype, the wonders of technology again. And then another improbable, the bell. That's the bell being run on the USS Cod. Notice what it says? And now, a lot of people say, wait a second, did you retrieve the bell when you went down and took all those pictures? No, we didn't. You weren't supposed to carry a bell when you went to war. So it was removed in Pearl Harbor. And it's now sitting in the Welcome Center where Paul Watson helped me retrieve it for that event in Greenville, Mississippi, the Mississippi Delta. And it was retrieved by this gentleman, a chaplain in the Navy. And he'd been in World War II, and then he re-upped for the Korean War. And when he came back through Pearl Harbor, he saw the bell in a scrap heap. And he said, can I have it? And they said no, normally. But he filed for it officially, and they sent it to him. And he took it home to Mississippi. And what's interesting is he didn't know that one of the Grunion sailors came from Greenville, Mississippi. So, as I say, improbables and improbables. And this was a story from 1984 when they did find out. Here's another improbable, the Shinoda family. That's Isamu Shinoda in the upper left, and then Chiyo in the middle. Chiyo at that time was 100 years old. Chiyo, Isamu's wife, lived in Tokyo, and Isamu was commander of the subchaser that the Grunion sank. And long story, but this was Utaka, and the network that we had built up in Japan said, this has been such an incredible international collaboration. This is time to say, this war thing is not the best way to settle arguments. And so we made an attempt to contact. Initially, it was unsuccessful, but try again. And she joined us, and that's Utaka in the middle. That's Kazuo on the left, and Chiyo sitting there with the other son, Masaki, and a grandson on the far right, Tetsuo. And that's Kazuo and Isamu in 1941. And when they were married in 32. What makes this interesting is sort of the parallelism between their family and our family. We both lost husbands, so to speak, and fathers, and we grew up, surviving. And it's fascinating. It creates a bond in itself. She sent him some prayer bags. We had another improbable. We had sent her some flowers from Kiska. And it turns out that's what her husband had done. And that's myself, my brother Brad, who died in 2008, but fortunately he was able to see the recovery. Oh, darn it. And this is a poem that Mary said. Where did you say it came from? Yeah, this was found on a wall in Auschwitz, but it's a Jewish prayer. And this is, I think, kind of the symbolism. They who are lost are family in that sense. And it's not just the Grunion, it's the people of the sub-force and all the sailors who lost their lives. And I'm going to close with this. Another, as it turns out, improbable. Number one, the water is not that rough. And number two, you can see Kiska, the entire mountain. I don't know if you've ever flown to Japan, but look down at the Aleutians. You'll never see it. So anyway, that is my story. Glad to take questions. Jeremy?
If you have questions, please raise your hand and I'll come to you.
First of all, did the gun from the freighter, was that responsible for sinking the submarine? And second of all, you showed a picture of the freighter beached. Was that as a result of the attack?
The answer to the first question is very unlikely that a shell, that was an 8-centimeter or 3-inch shell, and it could not have penetrated the hull, particularly it's a double hull, even the conning tower. It wouldn't have. The description in the captain's logbook is it hit the washing wave. And of course, we have a lot of interpreting to do, both from a language point of view and then independent of language. You know, what do they mean? What, how, and what? We would love to ask more questions. So I think that's unlikely. And the second question again? Yes. Yeah. That was the result of the torpedo. After it was beached, however, planes from Dutch Harbor and later ADAC came over and bombed it. In fact, when we were on Kiska, the biggest danger was falling into a bomb hole. I don't know how often we hit them, but we certainly dug a lot of holes.
Sir, just a minute. Let me hand you the microphone, please.
If the gunfire from the freighter didn't do it, what caused it? The submarine to sink.
Okay. This is pure speculation. One of the things we observed with this wreck is that the superstructure that goes through the conning tower and its bars that go up and has the antennas on it is bent forward. And there's a big sort of round dent in it. And we can't account for the 6th torpedo. There was a 6th torpedo. So the suspicion is the only thing that could have pushed it forward is something that hit it from the back, because the submarine went forward when it sank. It was obviously at a fairly steep angle because the bow broke off. About 50 feet of the bow broke off. It hit, and then it slid and ski jumped down the side of the volcano. And I drove up that volcano with the ROV, and I saw these big cliffs and so forth, and was sort of thinking in my head, what could have happened? But the fact that it was moving forward suggests that perhaps that last torpedo was a circular run. And a circular one works this way. If it starts to curve, it creates a curve in which the submarine is on the perimeter. So it's going to come back. And when the captains know that, they either sharply dive or change direction. They may not have had a warning. All we know is that there was an observation that there was a circular trail of bubbles, but we don't know what that means. If, in fact, it had hit the conning tower, that would have created a lot of panic, certainly in the control room, and maybe even knocked people out. Don't know, certainly would have knocked them down. And if you may have noticed, the stern dive planes are in the fully down position. And it turns out that in early 1942, when the Grunion was still at the Electric Boat Company in New London, another ship collided back into, I'm not sure exactly what it was. It was a limited discussion. And they said they checked for damage, particularly to the dive planes. The question is, did they check enough? The one thing that it's very hard to check for is if you turn it fully, does it jam? And then you can't undo it. Now, there were options. You could blow tanks, and I'm sure they did, and so forth. But I'm not sure they could have gotten to them if it was at a steep angle at that point. So we think that it was an external event to the actual firing from the ship. And it sort of is timed with what another torpedo would have done.
Mr. Abele, to your right.
One other possible explanation, anybody here has been in submarines and on a World War II type boat, they were apparently trying to dive, put full dive on the bow planes, on the stern planes, and in addition, in that class of a boat, you destroyed the buoyancy by flooding what's called negative tank. And I've been on one that, in practice, was diving and flooded negative tank. And it could get out of control in a hurry, and in a wartime situation, it may have just lost control of it.
We suspect it was a loss of control of some sort.
The boat that I was on, that happened to in the Atlantic, according to the depth gauge, came within 10 feet of the bottom before we got it under control.
Wow.
And then popped to the surface because all the tanks were blown at that point.
Well, the regulated depth, the depth that they were not supposed to exceed, was 300 feet for the Gato class. And at 600 feet, it would have imploded. And it's at 3,200 feet. The interesting thing is, the sub is 300 feet long. So the depth is only 10 times the length of the sub. But once they get going down, they go very fast. And we did talk to some experts about that, too. They recorded the speeds. But thank you for that observation. Yes?
I'll be right with you.
Thank you. How do you suppose they got the hatch open, or was it pressure?
Into the
That did
microphone.
Yeah, the question is how did they get the hatch open? And that, we believe, occurred when the implosion occurred. Because, in fact, if it had imploded, the pressure inside the submarine would have been phenomenal. Anything that could have popped would have popped. So that's what you think it was. The fact that the dog is snapped off, that had to be an enormous amount of pressure to do that. So that's what we think that was.
Everyone would have been dead at that time.
Yes. The question is, would everybody have died? Yeah, if the implosion occurred, it would have been instantaneous.
One last, oh, we got two over here.
How were you able to determine your longitude and latitude of the wreck? Was it through satellite or radar when you finally saw it on your side scan radar, sonar?
That's a very astute questions. GPS does not work underwater. And we actually concocted a device that allowed us to see where the descender was and the actual, there was a signaling device on the side scan scanner, on the descender, and on the boat. And they talked to each other, and they were supposed to draw a map. Now, as it turns out, one of them stopped working, and as a result, it didn't work at all. So we used what Navy people have used since the beginning of time, a little bit of judgment. They call it layback measurement, and they knew the speed, they knew the angle, and they had gone in both directions and gotten positions in both directions. They knew exactly where the boat was, and then they had to figure out how far behind and was there an angle on the actual device. And here's kind of the amazing thing. We went out, and this is probably the most improbable of all. One of our crew members, by the way, was a gentleman from Woods Hole. So, you know, these are the experts of the experts. And had worked with Ballard and the Titanic and so forth. But he was there as a friend, not a Woods Hole person. And they are the ones who said, you know, you're not going to find this thing. We lowered the ROV down. And when we got down, it took a while to get down to the bottom. We went past all sorts of fish and jellyfish. That was a lot of fun. But when we got to the bottom, it took us 20 minutes and we found the sub. You know, that's about as improbable as you can get. We sort of say to ourselves, they wanted to be found. We had a little bit of help from up above on this.
Last question over here.
This had to be a very expensive venture. How did you finance this project?
I knew that was going to come up. I was asked this question on a Today Show thing, and you know, they wanted to know how much, and my response was about 10% of what it would cost if the Navy had funded it directly. So,
Well, thank you all. Before Mr. Abele leaves the stage and Dr. Mueller takes the stage, this is one of the books that he was referencing earlier. It's the photo supplement to Fatal Dive, which we have for sale over in our retail. We've got two of them that those of you that stayed will get an opportunity to take one of these home with you. I cannot read this name. Somebody who has writing like myself. So you must be left-handed like me. Is there a Babineau in the audience? Right there, sir. You and I need to get a drink later. And then the last one. Jan Orick. Yep. Still in the building, so therefore she still gets it. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Abele. And Dr. Mueller, please take the stage.
Well, thank you for a wonderful evening, sharing your personal story of the loss of your father and then the discovery that brought you together again. It's just been an amazing adventure for all of us this evening, and should inspire all of us to go out and try to do the improbable and try to search for our own family roots, no matter how difficult and how challenging. We're a little bit of a kindred spirit here, John, because when you said, you know, that you don't have a chance, I think that's what people told Steve Ambrose and I about this museum when we got started. You're never going to do this, and but your persistence, like those and so many people who helped build this institution, it's all about people, and I think your journey opened the lives of so many other people in Japan and around this country, and the people that you connected with through the adventure and the discovery and the search and the persistence, I know has enriched your life and the lives of so many others in the process. And that's one of the big takeaways for looking for history, saving history, and of course reconnecting with the last moments of your father's life. We're coming to the end today, but I think it would be remiss if I did not at least mention that that here we're talking about a war orphan. Very often we talk about the widows and the spouses who lose their husbands, but children are left behind too, and there's a hole there, a void throughout their lives. John has filled that void with some part through this discovery and rediscovery of what happened in those final moments. And so I think we should always remember here in this museum about those children who grew up without a father as a result of the calamity that we refer to as World War II. You've already heard now from Jeremy about the book signing. The books are to be purchased over here, are going to be signed right over there. Okay, so you all know what to do. Thank you very much for being here. It's been a wonderful evening.